It's a story that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. A young man is driving his car down a country road several miles away from his house. He runs out of gas, and with his cell phone in his pocket, he begins to walk home instead of calling for a ride or calling for help. He leaves his wallet in his abandoned car. Then, as he's walking down the middle of a lightly traveled country road, he does not hear or see an approaching vehicle which strikes him and leaves the scene.
For the last few months, a picture of what happened is finally starting to emerge. Our sources close to the grand jury have confirmed that Smith, while walking toward his home on Sandy Run Road, was struck quickly and violently by a fast-moving object on the front of his face at an angle, apparently as he was attempting to evade being struck. Almost instantaneously, there was a second impact, the back of his head on the pavement of Sandy Run Road.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, there you heard it from the editor of Fitz News. They seem to have some links to, or some sources who know people in the grand jury or know about the grand jury investigation. And so assuming that those sources are reliable, we've gotten quite a lot of new information in terms of the Stephen Smith case. You may remember that I covered that case in depth. I did do a several episode deep dive trying to figure out if there was a murder link, a murder connection to the Stephen Smith case, and then also trying to find out what happened. And so we're going to look at the new information that's come out several months after quite an expensive investigation was launched into this particular case. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I actually went to the scene. I was actually in very near to Moselle. I went to Moselle as well, took photos at the scene, and I'll be sharing some of those photos and some of my insights in the rest of this analysis. If you're finding this analysis useful, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started.
Literally within a second, these two seismic impacts. Smith died at the scene where he fell. He died immediately. All the forensic evidence, which has now been reviewed and thoroughly re-reviewed, points to this conclusion.
So you may remember that I independently reached the same conclusion. It's not really rocket science if one looked at the incident scene, and you may remember that I said it's too graphic and too grisly to show, but I did direct you to where you could view that image, but you could clearly see that he did die on the scene, right? And now that has been confirmed. That has been confirmed by an independent investigation. And so remember there was a lot of debate and dispute. Was he killed somewhere else and brought there? I said that was not the case. Did something happen by his car? Was he attacked by his vehicle or something like that? Do you remember I said that he, for whatever reason, did leave his vehicle and he was walking home to, was it his grandfather's house? He lives just around the corner. It was within a mile of his grandfather's home when he was actually struck. And so what they seem to be suggesting here is that he was struck by the mirror of a vehicle. So he was struck by a vehicle based on this investigation. And the other aspect that's quite interesting is that there seems to be an indication that it was deliberate. And the indications are, firstly, because there were no skid marks, but also because the boyfriend of Stephen Smith, Bickart, you may remember that he'd provided some information where he'd said that Stephen had had an argument with two people earlier that night, and that Bickard had also apparently heard tires in the background. And so there is a suggestion now that this was a deliberate impact using a vehicle, and now apparently two people have been identified.
Smith was not killed somewhere else and dragged to the scene. His body was not dumped in the middle of the road. He died where he fell. Now, what was the fast-moving object? As I've stated from the beginning, this investigation has been clouded by the crime scene, which is a study in contradictions.
I think it's also fair to say that this particular case has been clouded by the murders, that this case is sort of being revisited and remembered within the fabric of the Murdoch case. And so it's very normal and it's very natural to think that, if it was so close, and if Stephen was in the same class as Buster, and you may remember that Buster actually made a statement saying, disavowing any connection. But the point being, there was a lot, that was something else that was complicating this investigation, was this notion that the murders were somehow involved, right? And I think it's important to remember that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Just because other people in that area had died and been killed didn't necessarily mean that Stephen Smith had been. Although it did seem, at certain points, it seemed likely. What was needed here was to investigate the scene, to let the evidence guide you, not let your gut guide you. And so, as I say, I did actually visit the scene, and I got a sense of what it was like walking on the road. I specifically went there when it was becoming late at night, dusk, and I got a sense of, is there enough room on the road to actually walk on the road? And I found that there was. And, the further one has got to walk from A to B, the more one is going to want to have a level surface and a dry surface to walk on. And so one can clearly see that Stephen Smith would have been tempted to do that. And I had a similar experience near the Beaufort sign where I parked my car and I walked quite a long distance on like a grassy verge. And it was quite long grass, and it just wasn't very easy to walk on this verge, and it was also sloping. And even though it was dangerous, and even though there was a lot of traffic on the road, I elected to walk on the road instead, just and take my chances and kind of look out. And I do wonder whether Stephen Smith didn't do the same thing. The other thing is, you feel like, well, I'm safe. I'm on this side of the road. I'm on the margin. That's allocated to me. And vehicles are allocated to another area. And so it does show that my thinking was accurate in terms of that, based on this investigation.
There were no skid marks. There was nothing at the scene that seasoned highway patrol investigators found to be consistent with a vehicular strike. And the pathologist who did the initial autopsy on Smith said that the only reason she concluded it was a vehicle strike was that he was in the middle of the road.
Now, of course, you just heard additional information here that there was a severe gash on the front of poor Stephen's head, but there was also a gash on the other side. And that does seem to support a notion that you knocked down, right? And that is, if you remember the way that I reimagined it, that is exactly what I suggested had happened.
Nothing about this crime scene indicated a vehicular strike, and yet, again, all the forensic evidence, including the flow of blood from Smith's body as he died on that scene, clearly indicated that he died again right where he fell. So how do you balance these apparent contradictions? But we're starting now to put that narrative together as we look at the evidence that we've released again on Fitz News, interviews that pointed to the theory of the truck mirror.
So you may remember that one of the theories I suggested on True Crime Rocket Science was that there was some thing that was protruding from a vehicle. It could be a log on a log truck. It could be that they were transporting farm equipment, and it was sort of a irregular shaped type of tractor or something like that. But something was protruding beyond the normal of, say, a sedan. And so that turns out to be what they're thinking as well, that it was possibly something like a truck mirror that caught Stephen Smith in the face. Now, the other thing with a truck, we're not talking about some kind of small sedan. The bigger the vehicle, the less likely it is that you would know that you'd struck something or someone. And so that is also, I think, potentially a factor here. It does seem, and you're going to hear it in a moment, that the investigators seem to believe that this was deliberate, hence the naming of suspects.
This past week, we exclusively reported on FitzNews.com that grand jurors were hearing testimony related to this truck mirror theory, which holds that it was an extended mirror from a truck driven by one of two primary suspects, and we're going to talk about that in just a second, which created the 7.25-inch massive laceration on Smith's head. That was the first impact, which then created that second instantaneous impact of the back of his head on the pavement.
So the other thing that could be the case, even if it is deliberate, was that someone tried to scare Stephen, tried to basically feign riding towards him, and maybe they even underestimated the width of the mirror, or they expected Stephen to get out of the way, something like that. It's not absolutely clear the level of intentionality, and that'll probably be decided if this case does go to trial.
What specifically that evidence is at this point, we don't know. We do know that, as we reported this week, one of those two primary suspects in this case allegedly indicated deception regarding some component of this truck mirror theory. We also know that Mark Bickart, who described himself as Stephen's boyfriend at the time he died, spoke of Smith allegedly being accosted by two, quote, rednecks at a convenience store in the hours before his death. Bickart recalled hearing mud tires in the background of his final conversation with Stephen Smith just moments before he died. Could that have been the truck that struck Smith with that mirror?
So we seem to have narrowed down the possibilities, and I think it's going to come down to the suspects that have been identified. Do they own a truck? Where is that truck? What are the details around that truck? And so if you can match the suspect to a vehicle, and there's some kind of damage to a vehicle, maybe some component that has been replaced, then I think we might see a trial, and who knows, we may see justice in this case at the end of the day. Let's hope so. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.